let me explain my method, my process of thinking, and then the techniques I use when I need to draw rock formations, whether they're in a natural setting, such as this bushland track, where there are rock formations on each side and even underneath. But the same process used if they're in a street landscaping or domestic garden setting. So in my thinking, the important thing is to be thinking all the time of edges and values. One of the problems we have with rocks is that they're of such random shape. They are certainly 3 dimensions, but how any one rock looks depends a lot on whether it's totally natural or whether it's been partially shaped by people or whether it's been broken as well as eroded as part of its life. In Australia, these sandstone blocks have tumbled down from higher up, and so they often get chipped and broken, as well as weathering reasonably easily if they're just left undisturbed. So we have a combination of chipped, broken sections that give a sharper edge, but also of roughly rounded parts as well, where they're more weathered. Now, I'm using a finer pen here to provide a sort of an outline, I suppose, but I don't want to draw an outline because, as I said before, edges are really important. Not so much the silhouette edge, but edges where the rock changes direction within what we're looking at. And this is quite common, and sometimes those edges, and I guess I'll use the word edge in inverted commas, is quite sharp. Sometimes though, it's quite rounded, but it still is a shift of direction that catches shadows in a certain way. And so what I don't want to do is do an outline over all of these change of direction places, because an outline is going to read as a very sharp edge. And while there are a few places on these large boulders that you could draw accurately in that way, most of the changes of direction are somewhat more rounded than that. And so I need to find marks that will capture this variation. The other thing though, besides the edges, are the values. So the lights and darks that are created both by the 3-dimensional form of the boulder that we're looking at, the rock formation we're looking at, but also according to the direction of the sun. We're needing to pay attention with that and get a sense of the relative values. Whenever I look at any drawing subject, actually, one of the first things I'm thinking of is what are the darkest areas, the really dark areas, the areas where I might actually even just basically colour it in totally with black ink as opposed to the next darker areas. And then it becomes trickier when we're looking at not extremes of light or dark, but those mid areas where we have a bit of a grayscale effect. And if you're wondering what I'm talking about, have a look at all that foliage in the upper right section of the reference. If we were to take out the colour, it would be very hard to see what that was, besides being a grey blur if we just cut that section out. That's probably going to be the biggest challenge in this drawing, in fact, not so much the rocks. So I've switched to a 0.3mm pen, which is going to be the largest pen I use in this drawing, because I'm wanting the closest things to feel closer. This is a pathway that goes back quite a long way, and the distance between the very closest stone flagging, I suppose it is, or stone step down in the front left corner, and the rocks at the furthest point in the centre, and even the trees, the foliage we can see beyond the rock formations, is quite significant. And I want to create a feel, a sense of that distance. I want to capture the effect of the distance. And one way I'll do that is to establish lighter lines as I move further back, to mimic the fact or convey the fact that as things get further away, we don't see them as clearly, we don't see as much detail, and the colours aren't as bright. But for now, I'm concentrating in the opposite sense that these closest things we see in more detail, the values are darker. That means I'm using my thickest pen, heavier, more considered strokes, and I'm layering my hatching lines to create darkness. I'm also paying more attention to edges, because these edges are going to be really apparent, really obvious. So I spend relatively more time for each section of rock here than I do with the rocks that are further back. And I'm particularly looking at my reference for where there's an edge, a corner, where the rock changes direction in a significant way. Has it been cracked off, chipped off, and given us a sharp edge which is still there? Or has it been somewhat softened by, as in the case of these steps, people stepping on them, rubbing the bottom of their boots against the edge of the step, or simply by weathering? And so it's finding marks that will capture this. But there's no simple right answer for this, as in how to do these marks, how to do this hatching, because every rock is different. And the direction that we do our hatching lines is going to change because of all these variables that make what is going to be visually a really effective way in one rock or in one scene not work so well in another. And I must admit, I did get myself a little tangled up with this rock I'm doing now, and that section at the lower left of the rock, where the lines change direction very abruptly, was, I think, my just not paying attention at the time. I looked at the reference, I looked at the rock in the photo, but I didn't look back at the lines I'd already drawn to work out which direction for the hatching was going to blend in best with what I'd already done. And so I went horizontally instead of keeping that somewhat more vertical emphasis, just adjusting the angle of it to fit what was happening with the three-dimensionality of the rock underneath. At this point, what I'm really wanting to do is to create a sense of the surface. And it's a bit of a compromise here between not trying to do too much at the detail of the rock surface, but not simplifying it too much either. We don't want these rocks to look like balloons. But equally, if we pay so much attention to every detail that we can see in a photo, we're going to be overwhelmed with the detail and will end up putting way too much ink in many places. And that's not going to create a real effect as well, because we also want to balance the ink we put on the page and where we place it, so that at the end, the things that stand out are the things that we want to stand out, and they stand out in a way that creates the three dimensions, not just of the object, but of all the object layered back in depths of plane. Now, this rock I'm doing now is, with the exception of those paving rocks at the front that act as steps, this rock is actually the closest rock, and therefore it's worth a little more time and attention and darker value. And we have two issues here. We have the shade that happens on each rock from where the sun is, the parts of the rock that the sun doesn't reach. But we also have some shadows from overhanging trees that go over the rock totally and over part of the path. And so at the moment, I'm working on hatching to represent the shade, the parts of the rock that the sun can't reach. And I'm particularly focused on having these curve in a way that suggests the underlying three-dimensional form. But at some point soon, I'll start to do some hatching that's going to be much lighter and much longer hatching that will just basically layer over the top, and that's to reflect the light shadows that are being cast on top of the shade and light that we have otherwise on the rock, if that makes sense. I have a video on the difference between shade and shadow that, if you're not sure about it, is really worth watching. It's a very helpful distinction to understand, and to understand how it works and what it means for how we draw. And if you're finding this helpful, please hit the like button for me. And of course, you'll find this reference photo on my community page, or my post page as it's called now, and I'll put a link to that post in the video description. Continuing with my 0.3 at this point, and I'm only going to use it for these two closest rocks and just a couple of the ones just a bit back for the one on the left, and then I'll be switching my pen if I haven't already. You'll be able to see which pen I'm using by the number, the width number that's down on the barrel right at the end. Now, looking at going beyond. Now, this is where I really need to pay attention with lightening the effects I'm creating. Lighter lines, thinner lines, more lightly drawn, not as close together, because this is where, when I start doing beyond these closest rocks, I really want to visually create quite a different impact, quite a strong sense of this is further back. But now I'm coming back to this big rock on the left, and you can see what I'm doing with the hatching, how I'm trying to hatch in a way that conforms approximately to the major shifts of direction and how they're emphasized by the play of light on each rock. Now, there's also some color as well as shadows and shade on these rocks that I presume has come from bushfires. But I'm not letting myself get too distracted by that. I think if I try and include those in a black and white drawing, it's going to be harder to understand what's happening. So I'm just leaving that for now. Now, here we have this hatching for this, what I think is by far the most challenging part of this drawing, which is this rather large mid-tone of foliage that goes from being very close to quite far distant. And I do want to capture a sense of that. I do want to try and have a feel that some parts are closer than others, and yet I do just have a thin black line. At this point though, I'm trying to, using a thicker pen, do some of the closer details and hoping that somehow when it's all finished and there's a great tangle of marks on that it will still read as being closer. Because I do still want this to be a tangle, this close bit. I want to simplify far more what's in the distance that basically in this shot is in stronger light. But all of this closer foliage, which is shaded, I want to still have a sense of it being closer and a sense of the thick tangleness of it, because that is very much a part of the Australian bush. Now I'm working on some of these further rocks, trying to go lighter, but I'm using the same principle with edges and value to try and create the feel of them. Now, for some of these rocks a bit later, some of the closer ones, I will draw a harder line around some of the edges, but never start to outline rocks such as this. Because in life, the way those edges look depends on what's happening and where the light is. If we have a surface that rolls around on a fairly gentle slope out of view, and if there's sunlight on that, it creates a very, if you like, minimal edge. Whereas if there's actually a hard edge in a certain spot because of the way that the rock is broken, and that coincides with the silhouette edge, and if that's in shade, then that's going to look a lot heavier, a lot darker, and we can draw that perhaps with a line that's stronger. And there may be parts where because it's curving away and it's a very minimal impact visually, we actually just have a few dots. We don't even want to have the emphasis of a line because that's going to make it look less three-dimensional. So it's being aware of the possibilities and juggling them all the time. And please hit the like button for me if you're finding this helpful and haven't done it already. I now need to start to put some work into the furthest back parts of this drawing because I can't really adjust the values, the darknesses closer to us until I see what I've got for the furthest parts. Because if I go a bit too dark in these further parts, I have to darken even more what I've done closer to maintain the relative difference between the closer and further sections. But you can see how almost entirely through hatching this drawing is happening. This scene is hopefully emerging from the paper and emerging from the tangle of small black lines. This drawing took me about just under 90 minutes to do, about an hour 20 in real time. So you're watching this at a quarter of my drawing speed. So if you use the settings icon, the cog icon there, you can reduce this in speed by half, which will make it half my drawing speed and give you a much better opportunity, if you want, to really pay attention to, particularly when I'm doing those rocks at the start, to where and how I start and finish the lines. Creating a bit of a jagged edge is very helpful with our hatching, rather than drawing a line at all. And the direction, the place where we start the hatching lines from makes a big difference. If I'm hatching, say, the edge of those steps down the front, makes a big difference if I start my pen at the top on the edge, if you like, and then pull it down, or if I started at the bottom of the step and lift it up, and then I can lift off the pen and get a lightly feathered effect on the top end. That creates a much softer, more rounded feel than doing it the other way. And we only find these things out by experimenting. What I would suggest, if you have trouble drawing rocks, natural rock formations, but that they come up in the subjects you like to draw, is just get some photos and just draw the rocks. Don't bother trying to draw the whole scene. Just work on the rocks as a focus, one by one, in isolation. It's easier to draw a rock in isolation while we learn the skill of using the hatching to create a realistic effect for that particular rock. And when that's starting to work for us, then we can start to draw rocks in context. And I decided that this large rock on the the front left wasn't quite dark enough for the overall values. This is what I talk about, adjusting the values at the end. See what you think. Let me know whether you think it reads better now that I've just darkened just the leftmost side of this, the lower section of this rock. Do you think it works? I think it works. I think it just anchors that section without coming in front of the parts that really are in front. What do you think? G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. We're back now to the version where I haven't done that. But look, I hope this has been helpful. Rocks are great things to draw. They come up surprisingly frequently, but they're great practice for fine-tuning our hatching skills, our perceptions, and our drawing the effect of what we see, not what's actually there. Really is practice and assessing what we've done and fine-tuning what we do. I hope you give this a go. Make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time.